Usually when we think about paying off a massive debt, there is an expectation of absolute finality.
Yeah.
Like, you write the check, the bank zeroes out your balance, and you just walk away free and clear.
Right, done and dusted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But imagine a financial system where every single time you make a payment, the bank doesn't just take your money, they actually send you a detailed, painfully itemized letter reminding you of exactly how much you still owe.
Wow. Yeah, so a cycle of perpetual maintenance that just keeps you acutely aware of the deficit.
Yeah, it's not a system designed to free you. It's a system designed to remind you of your burden. And that feeling of a debt that never quite goes away is the exact paradigm we are unpacking for you today.
It really is.
In this custom-tailored deep dive, our mission is to examine a really fascinating ancient text. And it argues for a massive historical and spiritual paradigm shift. Like, it claims to document a transition from a system of endless, repetitive religious rituals to a single cosmic event that, according to the author, changes human history forever.
And we have a really rich stack of sources to guide you through the architecture of this argument today. We're looking at an excerpt focused on the biblical text of Hebrews chapter 10, alongside a foundational reference to 1 Timothy chapter 2.
Right.
But what makes this stack particularly illuminating is the accompanying analysis we have. So we've got contemporary thematic notes from an author named Lee Carl, and we are layering that modern synthesis with deep historical commentary written by Matthew Henry all the way back in 1710.
Yeah, it is a phenomenal combination of ancient text, 18th century philosophy, and modern analysis. But to be completely clear right up front, because these texts deal with very strong religious theology, our goal here isn't to preach or endorse these viewpoints.
Definitely not.
We are just here to act as your guides, impartially analyzing how this source material builds its case. And it builds that case starting with a surprisingly stark, blunt critique of its own ancient traditions. The text begins by arguing that the old system of laws and sacrifices was fundamentally flawed from its very inception.
Yeah, so the author of Hebrews opens by stating that the law was merely a shadow of good things to come, and importantly, not the very image of those things, which is essentially a Platonic argument.
Platonic, meaning?
Right. By Platonic, I mean the philosophical idea that the physical things we interact with on Earth are just pale, imperfect copies, shadows of a perfect eternal reality. Like a shadow can show you the rough outline of a tree, but you can't build a house out of it.
Because it has no actual substance.
Exactly. So because it was just a shadow, the text asserts that those sacrifices offered year by year continually could never actually make the worshipers perfect.
Which means relying on that shadow to fix a real, substantial problem is entirely futile. And the text gets incredibly explicit about the mechanics of this futility. It flat out says, quote, "It is not possible that the blood of bulls and of goats should take away sins."
Which is a huge statement.
It is. If you pause and think about the historical context, dropping that statement onto a first-century audience is a massive theological disruption. You are talking to a society whose entire rhythm, economy, and culture revolved around the physical temple and those literal animal sacrifices.
Yeah, it is a complete deconstruction of their prevailing religious infrastructure. And Lee Carl's modern notes help clarify the psychology of what the text is arguing here.
What does Carl say?
Well, Carl points out that the external law couldn't change human hearts. Instead, because these sacrifices had to be repeated constantly, they merely served as a remembrance again made of sins every year. So according to Carl's reading, instead of clearing the conscience and providing peace, the ritual actively reinforced a guilty conscience.
Bringing it back to the financial metaphor we started with, under that old system, making that animal sacrifice is functionally identical to paying only the minimum interest on a massive credit card bill every month.
Yes.
The actual principal debt remains completely untouched. The monthly payment just acts as a painful, recurring, physical reminder that you're still hopelessly in the hole.
That's a great way to put it. And Matthew Henry, writing in 1710, drills into the mathematical and philosophical logic of why this minimum payment fell so short.
Right.
Henry argues that the old system lacked an offering of what he calls infinite worth. The physical tabernacle, the ordinances of the Sinai covenant, Henry views these as mere emblems.
Because an animal isn't infinite.
Exactly. They couldn't purify the human conscience because a finite animal simply doesn't possess the intrinsic limitless value required to actually settle an infinite moral ledger.
So if the old system was just a shadow, a minimum payment incapable of clearing the debt, the text has to introduce a mechanism that actually zeroes out the balance.
Right.
And it illustrates this transition to what it calls the new covenant by pointing out a very specific, highly symbolic change in physical posture.
Yes, the contrast in posture operates as a brilliant literary and theological device here. The text observes that under the old system, every priest standeth daily ministering, offering those exact same sacrifices over and over again. They stand because the work is a loop.
It's never finished.
Never.
But then the text shifts the focus to Christ. It claims that after he offered one sacrifice for sins forever, he sat down on the right hand of God.
The standing implies endless, repetitive labor.
Right, and the sitting implies absolute completion. The ledger is closed.
Yeah. By this one offering, the text argues, he has perfected forever those who are sanctified. And to understand the underlying mechanics of how a single sacrifice could accomplish what millions of previous sacrifices could not, we look at the excerpt from 1 Timothy chapter 2 included in your sources.
Or says what?
That text describes one mediator between God and men who gave himself a ransom for all.
A ransom fundamentally changes the math of the situation. I mean, a standard sacrifice or a fine is just a penalty you pay to balance a scale. But a ransom implies you are actively buying something back from captivity.
Right, it's a rescue operation, not just a transaction.
Exactly.
And Matthew Henry's commentary hones in on the nature of that specific rescue operation. Henry points out that when the sufferer is of infinite worth, his free will sufferings carry infinite value.
Free will suffering.
Yes. This is the crucial concept balancing the text's argument. Henry stresses that an atoning sacrifice capable of clearing this debt must be capable of consenting. It must, of its own volition, place itself in the debtor's stead. Bulls and goats lack the capacity for moral consent. They are just animal.
They're just brought there.
Right. But Henry argues that Christ possessed that capacity and that voluntary willingness is the mechanism that injects the sacrifice with its eternal debt-clearing power.
Okay, I need to play devil's advocate for you as you listen to this, because there's a glaring logical question here.
Sure, go for it.
If the text argues that this single voluntary sacrifice offers a full, infinite pardon, and it explicitly quotes God saying he will remember sins no more, doesn't that create a catastrophic behavioral loophole?
What do you mean?
Well, if I believe this text and my debt is permanently wiped out, the logical conclusion is that I have a free pass to behave however I want. The check is cashed, so why follow any rules at all?
Yeah, it's a fair question, but the text actually anticipates that exact logical loophole and counters it by introducing a concept it calls the Holy Ghost witness.
Okay.
Now, that sounds like purely mystical jargon, but functionally within the argument, the text defines it as a radical internal rewiring of the human mind. The text quotes God saying, I will put my laws into their hearts and in their minds will I write them.
Oh, wow. So the motivation for behavior moves entirely from external threat to internal desire.
Exactly. Matthew Henry takes that psychological pivot further. He notes that believers derive from this atoning blood the actual strength and motives for obedience. It fundamentally shifts the paradigm of compliance.
You are no longer following a set of external rules out of a terrifying fear of punishment.
Right. The text argues that the realization of this massive unearned pardon alters the individual's core desires. You obey not because a standing priest is threatening you, but because your fundamental nature has been permanently changed by the finished work of the sitting mediator.
But if this radical internal transformation actually happens, it can't just exist in a vacuum inside someone's head.
Right.
It forces a change in how these people operate in the real world.
Definitely.
It moves the argument from a solitary cosmic theology straight down into ground-level practical sociology.
Yeah, because believers supposedly now possess boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, which the text labels a new and living way. They are immediately handed a set of highly practical interpersonal action items. The theoretical becomes deeply social.
Right. The commands that follow aren't about retreating to a mountaintop for isolated enlightenment.
No, not at all.
The text tells followers to consider one another, to provoke and to love and to good works. And it explicitly commands them, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together. It is a blueprint for building a highly resilient, interdependent subculture.
And that word provoke is a fascinating choice. It's an active, almost abrasive term, usually associated with starting a fight or an argument, but here it's weaponized to generate love and good works.
Right.
Lee Carl's notes emphasize this structural community building. He outlines the specific directives, Boldly draw near, hold tightly to your profession without swerving, actively consider how to spur each other on, and maintain physical presence with one another.
Yeah, it requires proximity. You can't provoke someone to love if you are entirely isolated from them.
Exactly. And Matthew Henry ties this back to their physical practices. He notes that the text's mention of having bodies washed with pure water is an allusion to baptism. But Henry argues this wasn't just a mystical rite of passage.
Oh, was it then?
It was meant to remind Christians that their everyday mundane conduct among their peers should remain pure. It's a call to an ethical, shared life. Henry states that the communion of saints is a great help and privilege. The central argument is that you take this ultimate, unfathomable privilege, direct access to the divine, and you immediately redirect that energy into serving the person sitting next to you.
That is fascinating. The text paints this incredibly warm, supportive picture of a community built entirely on grace. But what happens to the person who understands all the mechanics of this ransom, who sees the community functioning, and then deliberately, consciously decides to walk away from it?
Well,
Because the rhetoric takes a sudden, terrifying turn into the consequences of rejecting this system. And to understand why the punishment escalates so drastically, we have to look at the underlying mathematical logic of the theology, which Lee Carl's notes summarize perfectly.
right. Carl writes that the blood of Christ offers mercy, but when that mercy is openly rejected, judgment alone remains.
Judgment alone remains.
Yeah. It goes back to that concept of infinite worth. If your debt is infinite, only an infinite payment works. If there's literally only one infinite payment in existence, and you deliberately throw it away, logic dictates there is no alternative mechanism left to clear your ledger. You are stuck with the balance.
Wow. And the language shifts from warm communal encouragement to uncompromising severe warning. The text argues that if someone sins willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sins. In its place, there is only a certain fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation.
Fiery indignation.
Yeah, fiery indignation is a long way from the provoke unto love we were just talking about. And the author leverages historical precedent to escalate the stakes.
Right.
The text argues that under Moses' old law, if someone despised it, they died without mercy based on the testimony of a few witnesses.
Right.
So the author asks, of how much sorer punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God?
Treading underfoot the Son of God, counting the blood of the covenant an unholy thing, and doing despite unto the Spirit of grace. I mean, the imagery is violently dismissive.
It really is.
And this is where we rely on Matthew Henry to ensure we define the exact parameters of this threat so it isn't misunderstood. Henry clarifies this passage is not targeting everyday human failures, moral slip-ups, or someone who just feels sorrow for sin.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
Very important. He defines it specifically as a total and final falling away. It describes a scenario where a person operating with a full and fixed will and resolution openly despises and rejects the foundational concept of the Savior. It is active, calculated, philosophical rebellion against the very premise of grace.
Which prevents the reader from panicking over every minor mistake,
Yeah.
but it makes the warning for total apostasy that much heavier.
Right. And Henry points out the tragic irony baked into this logic. He asks, what punishment can be sorer than to die without mercy? His answer is to die by mercy, by the mercy and grace which they have despised. The text asserts that in this specific scenario of calculated apostasy, both God's justice and his abused grace simultaneously demand vengeance.
You can feel the raw emotional weight when the text concludes this thought by stating, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. I mean, the author takes the sheer cosmic magnitude of the sacrifice we analyzed earlier and uses it to elevate the stakes of rejecting it to equally cosmic proportions. It is a terrifyingly sharp cliff edge to walk the reader up to.
It really is. But once the text has the reader looking over the edge of that terrifying cliff, it deploys a fascinating psychological strategy to pull them back. It doesn't just offer empty comfort, it actively leverages their own past trauma as fuel for their future endurance.
Oh, that's interesting. So the text commands them to call to remembrance the former days.
Yeah.
It forces this audience to look backward to a time when they were first illuminated, reminding them of how they already endured what the author calls a great fight of afflictions. It details how they were made a gazing stock by reproaches and afflictions, and how they even took joyfully the spoiling of your goods.
And that phrase, spoiling of your goods, carries immense historical weight. We aren't talking about losing a theoretical debate. We are talking about first century individuals having their businesses boycotted, their homes ransacked, their property confiscated.
Geez.
Right, and being completely ostracized from their societal safety nets simply because of their affiliation with this new covenant.
But to take the violent destruction of your own life's work joyfully sounds
Mhm.
completely irrational to a modern observer. I mean, who is joyful about that?
Well, the text provides the psychological anchor that made it possible. It says they did this, knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and an enduring substance.
Uh,
Matthew Henry observes that the Christian spirit, as defined here, is not a selfish spirit tethered to the material world. From their newly rewired perspective, all earthly things, wealth, and status are but shadows.
there's that word again. So they could endure the loss of the physical shadow because they were absolutely convinced they possessed the eternal substance.
Exactly.
You know, it reminds me of a coach in the fourth quarter of a brutal championship game. The team is battered, they're exhausted, they're looking at the scoreboard and wanting to quit. The coach doesn't promise them the next 10 minutes will be easy. Instead, the coach reminds them of the grueling training camps, the 2 days in the blistering heat, the early season injuries they already survived just to get to this moment.
Right, yeah.
The rhetorical message is, you have already paid way too high a price to give up now. Cast not away, therefore, your confidence.
I love that analogy, and the text leans explicitly into that endurance, stating, "For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, you might receive the promise." The overarching message from the author, heavily emphasized by Henry, is that the just shall live by faith.
By faith.
Yes. The text argues that the divine is not pleased with those who draw back out of fear, but those who maintain their fidelity through great trials possess a grounded reason to hope. The present conflict, no matter how sharp or economically devastating, is framed as purely temporary when weighed against the enduring substance.
And the journey this source material maps out is incredibly profound. We started by examining the hollow repetition of ancient sacrifices, that endless minimum payment on moral debt that only reinforced a guilty conscience.
Right.
Then we explored the theological claim of a finalized cosmic ransom executed by a willing, consenting mediator. We saw how the internal realization of that cleared conscience was designed to birth a highly resilient, deeply interconnected community. We analyzed the terrifying mathematical logic of what the text claims happens if you willfully, calculatedly reject that infinite grace. And finally, we unpack how the text encourages its readers to find the grit to endure present suffering by looking at the track record of their own past resilience.
It is a structural masterclass in persuasive theological argument. And as we leave you today, there is a lingering thought based on these texts worth mulling over for you. This material suggests that the ultimate test of any belief system or worldview isn't found in its high-level logical theology.
Or how well it functions when life is comfortable.
Exactly. The real test is found in how its followers handle the spoiling of their goods.
Here, if you lose your earthly comforts, your social status, your financial security, if the world finally comes and strips away all the shadows, does your foundational worldview shatter into pieces? Or does that loss reveal an enduring substance underneath that no one can ever foreclose on?
It is a heavy question.
It is a heavy, exposing question, but it's exactly the kind of question this ancient text demands you ask yourself. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.